I remember the taste of my mother's bread, sweet with honey, rich with grain from the southern fields of Vidia Prime, baked before the work bells rang across our settlement. That memory returns to me now as I stand in the armoring chambers of the fortress monastery, watching crimson paint set upon my ceramite plates. 437 years have passed since I last tasted bread. 437 years since anyone called me by a name that wasn't Brother Cassius of the Blood Raven's Third Company. The Imperium tells its children that we are angels, living gods in consecrated armor, drawn from the Emperor's own genetic legacy to guard mankind from the night between stars. In picture books and cathedral murals, we shine like silver saints. Our bolters sing hymns of righteousness as we cut down heretic and alien alike. The propaganda feeds speak of glory, honor, vigilance without end. They never speak of the cost. To become an angel, you must first learn to forget that you were ever human. I was 11 when the chaplain came to our world. 11 years old, playing war games in the agricultural fields with my younger brother Matthias, while our parents worked the harvest lines. The sky was the color of burnished copper that day, heavy with the promise of rain that would never come. The drought had stretched for 6 months, yet the governor's tithes remained unchanged. In the outer settlements, desperation loosened tongues. People whispered words that would have earned a flogging in the capital. The thunder began just after midday prayer, not the rumble of weather, but something deeper, mechanical. Matthias and I climbed the tallest grain tower in our sector, our small hands biting into rusted ladder rungs as we rose towards the sound. What we saw rewrote our lives in an instant. Drop pods. 12 of them, falling through the atmosphere like meteors. Their retro thrusters carved bright scars across the copper sky. They struck the earth in perfect formation, each impact precisely calculated to surround our settlement without damaging the harvest infrastructure. When the smoke thinned and the ramps lowered, they emerged, space marines of the Blood Ravens. Even as a simple agri-world child who had never feared anything worse than feral groks, I knew what they were. Every Imperial citizen knows the Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's chosen, angels of death, but seeing them in person, watching those massive figures stride through our settlement, their shadows long over the dust, I felt something I had not expected. Terror. They were too large, too perfect, too far from anything human. Their armor murmured with embedded hymns as they moved. Each footfall carried a tremor. When they spoke, Vox-amplified voices turned plain words into decrees from on high. They had come for recruitment. The chapter required new aspirants, and Vidia Prime had been granted the honor of contributing to the Emperor's armies. When they called my name, my mother wept. The administrator told us it was joy, but her tears sounded like endings. She understood before the rest of us did. Her son would leave that day, and he would not return. Whatever came back, if anything did, might wear his face, but it would not carry his heart. The selection was swift and merciless. Physical testing, genetic screening, psychological evaluation. Of 300 children in our settlement, between 10 and 12, only 7 passed the initial requirements. I was among them. Matthias was not. I still remember his expression as the chaplain's servo skull completed his biological scan and moved on without recording his data. Relief tangled with disappointment. I envied him, even as pride burned in my chest. We were allowed no farewells, no final meals, no last night in a familiar bed. Attachment, the chaplain said, would weaken us in the trials ahead. We were no longer children of Vidia Prime. We were aspirants of the Blood Ravens, servants of the Emperor. Our old identities were impediments to be erased. The journey to the fortress monastery took 3 months aboard a battle barge called Litany of Fury. We slept in the lower decks, packed into dormitories with aspirants from dozens of worlds. Farm boys like me, hive gang fighters, tribal warriors from death worlds, noble-born sons of civilized planets. The chapter cast a wide net. It sought not only strength, but compatibility with the gene seed of its Primarch. During that voyage, we learned our first lesson in what it meant to serve the Adeptus Astartes. We learned about expendability. Of 47 aspirants who board the barge, only 32 survived the journey. Some died when early medical procedures failed as apothecaries began preliminary implantations. Others broke under constant combat training, bones snapping beneath regimens designed to prepare human children for a superhuman war. A few shattered mentally, unable to grasp the scale of what they were becoming. Those were the fortunate ones. They died quickly. The Blood Raven's fortress monastery sits on a moon called Aurelia's Grief, orbiting a dead star in a system long forgotten by Imperial cartographers. It is a structure of impossible scale, carved from living rock and reinforced with adamantium bulkheads that could endure orbital bombardment. Gothic spires claw toward the void, housing training chambers, meditation cells, and countless artifacts the chapter has reclaimed from across the galaxy. When I first walked those corridors, history pressed on me like a physical weight. 10,000 years of war had passed through those halls. Thousands of aspirants had walked the same paths I did. Most had died. The walls seemed to whisper of sacrifice, of boys who dreamed of becoming angels and found only death waiting in the dark. The true trials began the moment we arrived. They called it the Proving. Later, I learned it was merely the first hinge in a long machinery built to break us down and rebuild us into what the chapter required. For 6 months, we endured conditioning that would have slain full-grown men from our home worlds. We ran obstacle courses in powered armor, too heavy for our developing frames. We fought hand-to-hand drills against servitors, programmed to maim rather than simply defeat. We studied the Codex Astartes until we could recite doctrine in our sleep. Then we were tested on it, while pain gnawed at our minds like a starving animal. Of the 32 aspirants who had set foot on Aurelia's Grief, only 18 survived the first month. The dead were interred in unmarked graves in the monastery's depths. Their names were recorded in the chapter's archives, and never spoken again. We were forbidden to mourn. Grief, we were told, was weakness. Those who showed emotional attachment were given additional conditioning, drugs, hypno-indoctrination, and in some cases, the surgical reshaping of brain chemistry. I learned to stop caring about the names of boys who vanished from our ranks. It began as survival. It became something deeper, an amputation of empathy that would serve me for centuries. The first true implantation came after our initial training. The secondary heart, a backup system that would allow us to survive wounds that killed ordinary men. The surgery took place in operating theaters that dated back to the Great Crusade. Ancient machines hummed with restrained power as servo arms opened my chest and apothecaries remade my physiology. I was conscious throughout. Pain, they said, was part of the lesson. They were right. In the years that followed, I would be shot, stabbed, burned, frozen, poisoned, and crushed more times than I could count. The ability to seal pain away and keep fighting would save my life, again and again. It would also take something from me, something I did not realize I was losing until it was already gone. What followed became a blur of escalating trials and more surgery. The ossa modula to harden our bones, the biscopea to multiply strength and reaction speed, the hemastamen to enrich our blood and let us breathe where others would suffocate. Each implant drew us closer to the chapter's ideal. Each one carried us further from the boys we had been. I stopped dreaming of my mother's bread. I stopped dreaming of Matthias. I stopped dreaming of the copper sky of Vidia Prime. The conditioning was designed to sever every tether. By the time I received my 13th implant, the catalepsean node that reduced the need for sleep, I had forgotten what it felt like to miss home. I had forgotten that I had ever had a home. The black carapace was the final step, the interface that would let me merge with the machine spirits of power armor and weapons. It was also the most dangerous. Of the 11 aspirants who survived to that point, 4 died during the procedure. Their bodies rejected the synthetic material. They convulsed and expired as their immune systems tore them apart from within. We watched them die in recovery. I felt nothing. Not grief, not fear, not pity. That emptiness was the truest sign of completion. I had become something that could watch children die and remain focused on the mission. I had become what the Imperium needed, a weapon. My full induction into the Blood Ravens took place in the Reclusium, a cathedral chamber of black stone lit by thousands of devotional candles. Chaplain Mauricus spoke the words of binding, the oath that would anchor my soul to the chapter for whatever remained of my existence. I knelt before the altar of the Emperor and swore to defend humanity, to serve the throne without question, and to die before dishonor stained the chapter's name. When I rose, I was no longer the farm boy of Vidia Prime. I was Brother Cassius of the Third Company. The name I'd been given at birth was preserved in the archives and never spoken again. That person had died in the making. 3 months later, I boarded the strike cruiser Righteous Fury for my first deployment. Our destination was the Forge world Metallica Zeven, where reports suggested a chaos incursion threatened the planet's industrial output. We traveled 6 weeks through the warp, 6 weeks of relentless training. We rehearsed boarding actions in mock corridors. We fought servitors programmed with the patterns of known enemy forces. We studied the psychology of heretics until their choices became predictable equations. We maintained our war gear with devotional precision, learning that every bolt and power cell was sacred in the Emperor's service. We prayed, we meditated, we prepared our minds for the certainty of violence. Above all, we learned unity. Individual identity, our sergeant said, was a luxury the Adeptus Astartes could not afford. We were not 11 warriors seeking personal glory. We were one weapon split into 11 parts, expendable parts. This lesson was drilled into us through simulations in which squad members were randomly designated as casualties. Survivors were expected to adapt without hesitation or emotion. I learned to watch my squad mates fall and immediately recalculate firing lanes. I learned to step over their bodies if momentum demanded it. I learned to strip ammunition and equipment from their remains when supplies ran low, treating the dead as resources rather than men I had trained beside. These skills would save Imperial lives in the campaigns to come, but they carried a cost the recruitment posters never mention. Metallica Zeven was a world of perpetual industrial twilight. Its skies were choked with exhaust from countless manufactorums. The surface lay buried beneath strata of rock and steel. The incursion had begun in the lower industrial sectors. Reports claimed factory workers were engaging in forbidden rites involving the machine spirits of their equipment. A word-bearer detachment had been dispatched to investigate. Their Vox signals went silent 3 days before our arrival. Our mission was simple: locate the source of the disturbance, purge any heretical influence, and restore production to acceptable levels. The lives of individual workers were deemed acceptable losses if their sacrifice preserved the Forge world's strategic value. We made planetfall during the artificial night cycle when manufactorums reduced output to conserve reactor fuel. Our drop pods struck the primary thoroughfare with calculated precision, minimizing damage while maximizing tactical advantage. When the ramps lowered and we stepped into sulfur-tainted air, I tasted real war for the first time. The silence was wrong. Metallica Zeven should have been roaring with industry. Instead, the streets lay empty, quiet save for the distant hum of automated systems. Warning runes flickered from voxcasters, broadcasting quarantine protocols and mandatory curfews in High Gothic. The air tasted of metal and corruption. My enhanced senses identified human decomposition mixed with something else, something absent from any Imperial record. Brother Sergeant Thalan raised a fist. Through reinforced windows, we saw movement in the dark. Human shapes, but disciplined, coordinated, waiting. The first shots came from above. Autogun rounds sparked harmlessly off our armor, revealing our attackers' positions. They were factory workers, and they were no longer fully human. Mechanical augmentation sprouted from their limbs in patterns that violated the doctrines of orthodox Imperial technology. Their faces bore the marks of mutation, signatures of warp exposure. We answered with controlled bolter fire. Mass reactive shells found flesh and metal alike. The corrupted died fast. But for every cultist that fell, 2 more emerged. They had prepared. The battle raged for 4 hours, drawing us through 17 industrial complexes before we reached the heart of the corruption. In the deepest levels of the primary manufactorum, we found what remained of the word-bearer infiltration team. They had built a shrine to the Dark Mechanicus within the reactor chamber, using the Forge World's own power to amplify blasphemous rites. The shrine was a fusion of technology and flesh that hurt to look at. A writhing mass of corrupted machinery and human tissue, pulsing with malevolent energy. Standing before it was something that had once been human, now hollowed into a vessel for the warp. It spoke in voices stolen from dead workers. It promised knowledge beyond the Omnissiah's sanctioned truth. It offered power beyond the crude gifts of our gene seed. And I listened with the silence of a weapon. Because by then, the boy who once loved his mother's bread had been gone for centuries. Evolution beyond the restrictions of our flesh. It showed us visions of what we could become if we abandoned our loyalty to the Corpse Emperor and embraced the truth of chaos. I felt nothing as I raised my bolter and put 6 mass reactive rounds through its torso. Nothing, except the clean satisfaction of fulfilling mission parameters. The corrupted thing collapsed into a scatter of flesh and metal, its death cry rolling through the reactor chamber as the shrine's power source flickered and died. The blight that had spread through Metallica 7's industrial sector would wither without its focal point. Manufacturing could be restored within acceptable tolerances. We had won our first victory. We had served the Emperor. We had shielded the Imperium from the reach of chaos. Everything had unfolded exactly as our training predicted it would. As we prepared to extract, Brother Varian offered an observation that haunted me for decades. The corrupted workers, he said, had fought with desperate courage despite impossible odds. They had died defending something they believed in, something that gave their lives meaning beyond survival. Their corruption was absolute, their damnation certain, yet they died with purpose. We, by contrast, had killed them efficiently and without emotion. No anger at their blasphemy, no satisfaction in their defeat, no grief for the lives they had thrown away. We had simply removed them because our orders required it, the same way one might replace a damaged cog or cleanse a bolter's barrel. This realization should have unsettled me. It didn't. I had been conditioned to see emptiness as strength. But in the quiet spaces between wars, I sometimes wondered what it might feel like to care about something enough to die for it, to believe so completely that death seemed preferable to betrayal of that belief. I would never know. The same conditioning that made me effective had also made me incapable of that kind of faith. I served the Emperor because I had been built to serve, not because I had chosen to believe. I fought chaos because orders required it, not because I truly understood why its influence must be opposed. I protected humanity not from love, but from duty. And duty without love is simply obedience. This is what they don't tell you about becoming a space marine. Yes, you gain strength beyond human limits. Yes, you inherit armor and weapons that make you nearly invincible against conventional threats. Yes, you become part of something vast and enduring. But you lose the ability to choose your own path. You lose the capacity for doubt, for questioning, for the dangerous independence that might lead to conviction instead of compliance. You lose the ability to form meaningful bonds with human beings, because you are no longer human yourself. You become a tool in service of an ideal you can no longer truly comprehend, because you no longer possess the emotional structure required to understand why that ideal matters. The campaigns after Metallica 7 blended into one continuous cycle of violence and victory. Orc incursions on agri-worlds where we butchered greenkins by the thousands, while local populations cheered our arrival. tow expeditions on industrial planets where we fought running battles against pulse rifle lines and battle suits that could match our armor measure for measure. Tyrannid swarms on death worlds where we held the line until ammunition ran dry, then continued with knives and bare hands until reinforcements arrived, or we died. Each war taught me new methods of killing. I learned to read a battlefield in moments, to adjust firing patterns for maximal casualties with minimal expenditure. I learned to identify structural weaknesses in enemy formations and exploit them with surgical efficiency. I learned to fight everywhere, from the vacuum of space to the crushing pressure of ocean trenches, against every kind of threat, from mindless beasts to strategists who could anticipate our moves and counter them in kind. But I never learned to care about the people we were ostensibly protecting. The billions of Imperial citizens whose lives rose and fell with the outcome of our wars remained abstractions, strategic assets to be preserved when possible, acceptable losses when necessary, nothing more. This detachment served me well when we were deployed to crush rebellion on civilized worlds, worlds where citizens had been led by charismatic voices promising better lives if they cast off Imperial taxation and regulation. Worlds where families fought us because they genuinely believed independence would serve their children better than obedience. On Castellan Thufev, we fought through residential districts where every building had been turned into a fortress by citizens who believed death preferable to surrender. They used furniture as barricades, kitchen knives as weapons, and their own children as shields because they knew we would not hesitate to fire through civilians to achieve our objective. They were right. We didn't hesitate. We couldn't. The conditioning that stripped away empathy also erased our ability to recognize the moral complexity of good people trapped on the wrong side of Imperial policy. I killed a woman on Castellan IV who was trying to evacuate her infant from a building we needed to secure. She was unarmed. She posed no threat. She was attempting to preserve innocent life, not resist our advance. But she was in our way. Obstacles were to be removed. I put a single bolt round through her center mass and continued forward without breaking stride. The infant died in the subsequent detonation when Brother Garavas used frag grenades to clear the remainder of the structure. I felt nothing. No regret. No guilt. No sense that I had committed an act worthy of moral consideration. She had been a tactical problem requiring a tactical solution. Her death served the Emperor's interests by improving operational efficiency. The child was an acceptable casualty in service of a greater objective. These were facts, not tragedies. That night, during the meditation period that followed combat, I found myself trying to remember her face, not from remorse, from concern, because I couldn't. She was human, female, approximately 30 standard years of age. Beyond those basic details, she had not registered as worthy of memory. She had been an obstacle, nothing more. This troubled me, not as sin, but as a possible defect in my tactical cognition. If I could not remember the faces of the killed, how could I be certain I was not missing details relevant to future operations? If civilians had become so indistinct in my perception, how could I accurately judge compliance levels or identify the shape of resistance before it hardened? I brought these concerns to Chaplain Moricus during my next confession. He listened with the mechanical attention all chaplains reserve for spiritual maintenance, then informed me that my observations were evidence of success. The ability to eliminate obstacles without emotional interference was precisely what the chapter required. The fact that I no longer perceived individual civilians as significant proved I had transcended the limitations of human empathy. He was right. Over the following decades, this absence became strategically valuable. I could fight through civilian zones without hesitation that might reveal weakness. I could make triage decisions without the drag of attachment. I could sacrifice squad mates if the mission required it, without grief clouding judgment. But it also meant I would never again experience the satisfaction of protecting something I loved. Victory became technical. Survival became continuation of function. Success meant only the completion of assigned objectives within acceptable parameters. This is the price of becoming an angel. You gain the power to protect humanity, but you lose the ability to understand why humanity is worth protecting. You become capable of heroism, but can no longer comprehend what makes heroism meaningful. The centuries passed. War merged into war until I could no longer distinguish one battlefield from another without consulting mission logs. I was elevated to veteran after my first century of service, then to sergeant after my second. The Blood Ravens recognized my tactical consistency and gave me command responsibilities that allowed me to shape the effectiveness of entire squads. I trained new battle brothers in the methods that had served me well. I taught the necessity of emotional detachment, the virtue of absolute obedience. By all objective measures, I was a success. My kill count exceeded chapter averages. My squads achieved objectives with minimal casualties and maximal efficiency. My tactical refinements were folded into standard procedures and distributed to other companies. I had become exactly what the recruitment posters promised, a living weapon for humanity's protection. But success brought its own revelations. As seniority granted me a wider view, I began to notice patterns in our deployments that suggested uncomfortable truths. We were not primarily sent to defend humanity from external horrors, as the propaganda insists. We were sent to enforce compliance with imperial authority, whether or not that authority served the interests of the populations we protected. On Voss Prime, we suppressed a worker uprising triggered by increased output quotas alongside reduced nutritional allowances. The workers were not corrupted by chaos. They were not manipulated by xenos. They had simply concluded that their lives had become unsustainable and that organized resistance might buy their children a future. They were wrong. Our intervention ensured their conditions became worse. But tithe compliance improved dramatically. On Morian, we participated in the pacification of a religious movement whose interpretations of the imperial creed diverged from orthodox ecclesiarchy doctrine. Their so-called heresies were minor, questions of theology debated for millennia. But their influence threatened local authority, and authority could not be allowed to appear uncertain. We killed tens of thousands in the campaign that followed, including entire settlements that had embraced the disputed teachings. On Necromunda, we supported Arbet's actions against gangs interfering with tithe collection in hive industrial sectors. The gangs were brutal, but they were also the only effective check on corporate overlords whose exploitation exceeded even imperial standards of acceptable extraction. We erased the gangs. Tithes improved. Worker mortality rose in the year that followed, higher than gang violence had claimed in a decade. Each campaign was a tactical success. Each strengthened imperial control over populations that might otherwise have developed effective resistance. Each served the Emperor's interests by cementing centralized rule. And each illuminated the contradiction at the core of space marine existence. We were made to protect humanity. Yet we spent much of our time killing humans whose conclusions about their own welfare diverged from the preferences of imperial administrators. We were sold as guardians, but we functioned as wardens. This realization should have disturbed me. It didn't. I could observe patterns. I could draw conclusions. But I could not measure them against moral criteria that might suggest an alternative to obedience. I served because I was constructed to serve, not because I had chosen to believe that service was inherently just. Over time, the accumulation of these observations formed a cold understanding of what I truly was, not a guardian angel, an enforcement mechanism, ensuring compliance with political structures that valued stability over justice, efficiency over compassion, authority over individual welfare. I was not a hero. I was a tool wielded by administrators who had never endured war, yet understood that violence could resolve problems that negotiation could not. I was not protecting humanity. I was controlling it. The 4th century of my service brought assignment to the Death Watch, chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos. It should have been a return to the clean clarity of Metallica 7. Clear enemies, obvious objectives, simple solutions. Aliens were not human. They could not claim imperial citizenship. They could be annihilated without the moral fog that human wars created. But even the Death Watch could not restore that simplicity. My first assignment was the elimination of a TOW diplomatic mission, attempting to establish trade relationships with imperial worlds along the Damocles Gulf. They offered advanced medical technology in exchange for raw materials their expanding empire required to sustain industrial growth. Several governors expressed interest, seeing a path to improve conditions for their populations while maintaining acceptable tithe levels. The Ordo Xenos deemed the negotiations an unacceptable security risk, not because the TOW planned immediate military action, but because diplomatic success might encourage other Xeno species to attempt the same. The Imperium's official policy was extinction, not coexistence. Any deviation would be read as weakness by enemies across the galaxy. We eliminated the delegation during a formal dinner hosted by the governor of Pavonis. 43 aliens died in the initial assault, along with human negotiators and civilian staff who happened to be present when we breached the facility. The governor survived. His security detail had been briefed on our timeline. He was later executed for treason. The tactical execution was flawless. No TOW survived to report the incident. Human witnesses were removed. The mission vanished without trace, allowing the Imperium to maintain plausible deniability while discouraging future attempts at peaceful contact. But the intelligence we recovered from the TOW complicated the simple narrative that justified our act. They had indeed sought trade, yet their motivations were not conquest disguised as diplomacy. Their empire was struggling to sustain refugee populations displaced by tyrannid swarms. They needed resources to keep civilian survival rates within acceptable thresholds. And I absorbed that truth with the same quiet precision I had applied to every other inconvenient fact in my service. Not with outrage, not with sorrow, but with the cold recognition of a weapon learning the shape of the hand that wields it. Their offers of medical technology had been genuine, valuable goods exchanged for raw materials imperial worlds could spare without weakening their own strategic posture. The TOW had been trying to save lives, not human lives, perhaps, but lives nonetheless. They had offered answers to problems that killed thousands of imperial citizens each year. They had attempted to build relationships that might reduce conflict instead of inflaming it. And we had killed them for it. This should not have mattered to me. To the Imperium, aliens were still aliens. Their survival was not my responsibility, and their destruction served Imperial interests by eliminating a potential long-term threat to human expansion. Whether they acted from desperation or aggression was tactically irrelevant to the strategic requirement of preventing alien influence from gaining a foothold in human space. Yet for the first time in 3 centuries, I found myself questioning whether the completion of mission objectives necessarily equated to success. Not from pity, not from guilt, from a purely tactical awareness of consequences that extended beyond the immediate kill zone. The elimination of that diplomatic mission had certainly prevented the creation of trade ties that might encourage other Xenos to attempt similar approaches. But it also erased an opportunity for intelligence gathering that could have revealed TOW capabilities, intentions, and structural weaknesses. It fortified Imperial isolation, but it also removed the possibility of a temporary alignment against tyrannid threats that endangered both human and TOW populations. It preserved ideological purity, at the cost of strategic flexibility that might one day be decisive. These observations troubled me not because I regretted the dead. They troubled me because they suggested our deployment decisions might be driven more by abstract doctrine than by measurable survival outcomes. If the Imperium's endurance was truly the primary objective, should we not be willing to bend ideology when the bend offered advantage? If protecting humanity was the ultimate goal, should we not be willing to exploit cooperation when cooperation served human interests? But the conditioning that made me an effective warrior also made me incapable of pursuing such questions to their logical end. I could detect contradictions in Imperial policy. I could outline alternatives. I could even predict which would yield cleaner outcomes on a strategic ledger. I could not decide whether those better outcomes deserved priority over political or theological considerations that lay above my rank and beyond my permitted thought. I served because I had been made to serve. The fact that I no longer understood why my service was valuable did not void my obligation. The fact that I could question my purpose while remaining incapable of changing my behavior was simply another feature of what I had become. The final revelation came during my 5th century of service, on a world whose name I was ordered to forget the moment our mission concluded. A world that officially did not exist in Imperial records, though it had once held 17 billion human souls. We were not sent there to fight aliens or heretics. We were sent to erase evidence. The population had been selected for an Imperial genetic engineering project meant to create humans capable of surviving environments too hostile for standard colonization. Enhanced lungs for thin atmospheres, modified pigmentation for punishing radiation, reinforced bones for heavy gravity worlds. The Adeptus Mechanicus had promised the Administratum that these changes would unlock new frontiers without the immense cost of terraforming. The project succeeded beyond expectation. The modified humans thrived in hostile conditions, but they also developed capacities their creators had not predicted. Improved cognition, heightened disease resistance, lifespans stretched not by decades, but by centuries. They had become something new, something that might in time supersede baseline humanity entirely. This could not be allowed. The Imperium was built on the assumption that human nature was static, that the species had reached its ordained form long ago, and that deviation was corruption rather than progression. These people were not merely a scientific achievement, they were a philosophical threat. If humanity could be improved through deliberate manipulation, then perhaps other pillars of Imperial doctrine could also be revised. Perhaps authority itself was negotiable. Perhaps obedience was not destiny. The solution was total elimination, a complete population purge, followed by orbital bombardment that would turn the world's surface to glass. No evidence would remain. No modified humans would escape to seed other planets with their alterations. No records would persist to suggest the project had ever existed. The world would become a cautionary ghost, a silent justification for the Mechanicus' orthodox oversight and the Imperium's fear of uncontrolled innovation. We were chosen not for our firepower, but for our emptiness. Imperial Guard regiments might falter at orders to exterminate a human population that posed no military threat. Planetary forces might question commands that demanded the murder of their own species for the crime of successful evolution. Space Marines would not. We no longer had personal feelings that could interfere with operational performance. The campaign took 6 months. Not because the modified humans were powerful in the conventional sense, but because 17 billion lives required time to locate an end, even with orbital support. They had built deep subterranean cities, anticipating that their world's hostile surface would drive civilization underground. They possessed technologies that allowed them to conceal themselves from our scans for extended periods. Most significantly, they had social structures that prized collective survival over individual preservation. Parents sacrificed themselves for their children. Communities coordinated defense instead of fracturing into competing factions. They fought with a desperate clarity I rarely witnessed, not the frenzied ruin of cultists, not the disciplined doctrine of tow fire lines, but the deliberate ferocity of people who understood exactly what our victory meant for their families. They knew we had not come to conquer. They knew we had not come to enforce compliance. We had come to erase them, to ensure that no trace of their achievements survived to inspire another world. They fought like humans defending a future. They fought with the same fierce devotion I had once observed in corrupted workers on Metallicus 7. Except this time, the devotion was aimed at preservation, not ruin. They fought for something they loved more than life itself. And we killed them all. Every man, woman, and child. Every family line, every cultural tradition, every innovation that might have improved the human condition. We dismantled a civilization that had reached in 3 generations what the Imperium had struggled to approach for 10,000 years. Not because they threatened humanity, but because they represented what humanity might become. I was present for the last phase, the breach of the final underground shelter complex where roughly 12,000 civilians had taken refuge, people who had never raised arms against the Imperium, children born after our arrival who would die before their first birthdays, elderly individuals whose only crime was living long enough to witness the apex of their altered species. When we broke their final defenses, they were not hiding. They were not pleading. They were singing. 12,000 voices harmonized in tunnels they had called home. Songs of love and loss and hope in the face of certain extinction. They wanted their last act as a species to be beautiful rather than fearful, creative rather than desperate, human rather than merely functional. I killed them while they sang. We all did. Our bolters answered their music with a different hymn. Each shot precise, each burst measured, each corridor cleared with the cold mathematics of efficiency. The singing died in sections until only echoes remained. Then the orbital bombardment began. I stood on the command deck of our strike cruiser and watched the world die. Cyclonic torpedoes cracked the crust. Virus bombs scoured what flesh might still have survived beneath stone. Within hours, a planet that had once held 17 billion enhanced humans became a cooling sphere of magma orbiting a star that would soon be erased from Imperial charts. The mission was declared a complete success. No evidence remained. No modified humans escaped. No records survived to suggest that humanity could evolve beyond its sanctioned limits. The Imperium retained its certainty. But as I watched that world burn, something returned to me that I had not touched in centuries, the taste of my mother's bread, honey and grain from the southern fields of Vidia Prime, baked in the early hours before the work bells rang across our settlement. The memory struck without warning, without context, without explanation. I had not thought of my mother or my childhood since my earliest decades of service. The conditioning had excised such attachments as weaknesses. Yet as I watched a species die singing, I remembered what it felt like to be human. I remembered what it felt like to taste something made with love rather than necessity, to anticipate pleasure rather than endure existence, to belong to something that existed for reasons beyond tactical efficiency. And I understood what I had lost. Not merely my humanity, something I'd been taught to regard as a necessary sacrifice. Not merely my emotional range, something I had been trained to dismiss as liability. I had lost the ability to understand what made life worth living, what made survival worth the struggle, what made existence preferable to extinction. Those enhanced humans had died singing because they still carried meaning inside their altered blood. They had preserved the capacity for love, hope, beauty, the forces that justify endurance when logic alone offers none. I had been stripped of those things. I had become something that could eliminate beauty without comprehending what beauty was, destroy love without understanding its weight, extinguish hope without knowing what hope gave to those who possessed it. I had become the perfect servant of an empire that preserved human life by eroding everything that made human life worth preserving. But this recognition changed nothing. I could observe the loss without regret, understand the price without rejecting it, recognize the contradiction without acquiring the freedom to resolve it. The same conditioning that formed my effectiveness also ensured my obedience. I was incapable of rebellion, incapable of doubt that matured into action, incapable of choosing a different path even if I could imagine one. I was exactly what the Imperium required, nothing more, nothing less. The centuries since that nameless world have blurred into an endless cycle of deployment and victory, conflict and resolution, service without purpose, satisfaction, or any promise beyond continued function. I have killed millions of enemies of the Imperium. I have protected billions of Imperial citizens. I have preserved the stability of countless worlds against threats both internal and external. I have served the Emperor faithfully for over 400 years. And I will continue until battle damage or time finally ends this engineered body. I am a hero of the Imperium, a living legend, a guardian angel in the eyes of children who dream of wearing my armor and carrying my weapons. They see me as everything noble and pure in human civilization, a figure worthy of awe. They do not know that I can no longer remember why their dreams matter. They do not know that I have forgotten what it feels like to care about anything beyond the completion of assigned objectives. They do not know that in becoming their guardian, I cease to be one of them. Perhaps that is the greatest victory Chaos could ever achieve against the Imperium. Not the corruption of its servants, but the creation of servants so perfectly dedicated that they can no longer comprehend the value of what they serve. Not the destruction of humanity, but the transformation of humanity's protectors into something that preserves human life, without preserving human meaning. We are the Adeptus Astartes. We are the Emperor's finest warriors. We are the shield between mankind and the void that hungers for it. We are no longer human, and we have forgotten why humanity matters, but we will continue serving. We will continue fighting. We will continue killing in the Emperor's name until nothing remains of us but bolter, fire, ash, and the memory of wars whose purpose we can no longer recall. We are angels without heaven, guardians without understanding, protectors without love. We are exactly what we were designed to be.